Payment, Part 7. The Waving Soldier. Assault Class Exo, McKay. 2. Standard issue powered exoskeleton designed for strength, speed, and endurance augmentation of Terran shock troops. Average cost, 150,000 standard Terran currency units. Approximate weight on Terra, 50 to 55 kilograms. Average increased life expectancy during combat operations, 475%. Estimated total produced during First Contact War, 10,000 units. One suit for one soldier. Measured to the millimeter to ensure perfect reproduction of natural movement and range of motion. Dozens of microprocessors coordinate sensory input to match the soldier's actions and force accurately enough to place contact lenses in the eyes, as well as perform basic tasks such as maintaining balance when the user is incapable. The design is such that all weight is transferred to the deck, meaning that, to the wearer, the Exo's mass should be virtually unnoticeable. The Exo was developed around a dual-power design. Electroreactive polymer controls initial movements, with response time and reaction speed such that a Terran nervous system will effectively register zero input delay. These EAPs provide significant strength enhancements over short time frames, allowing striking, jumping, and other movements that rely on immediate power production. The primary drive system, however, is based on liquid fluid dynamics. Hundreds of lifespans of research and tech development, and yet still the highest power density and precision per cost ratio is held by archaic hydraulic actuators. The Exo autonomously detects and reacts to the amount and duration of force generation by the wearer, switching seamlessly between both systems. This ensures movements can be both blindingly quick, with exponentially greater strength, a few Terran milliseconds behind. The Exo draws power from fuel cells. Originally developed for battleships' plasma cannons, Terran tech somehow massively reduced the size while managing to keep the reactants stable. At max draw, these fuel cells will last for 3 Terran hours, though normal combat missions estimate no less than 20 continuous hours of operation without refueling. Although actual capabilities vary with the user's size and personal fitness level, minimum acceptable specifications allow up to 70 Terran kilograms of gear without significantly impacting performance. It was amazing how far a primitive world could come, Jek thought, when they plundered tech from a dominant species. And nothing drives technological advancement like the crucible of interspecies conflict. Terra had not been granted the natural advantages of a combat species. Their war machine had built them into one. He looked curiously at the product of Terra's war in front of him. A small, soft creature, protected with ballistic armor that lacked even rudimentary shielding. Wielding kinetic weapons, wasteful and barbarous even among the outer rim. His weakness masked with metal and machine. The first-generation Exos had been driven only by electrochemical, battery-powered hydraulic cylinders. Brutally strong but lacking speed and quickness, prone to failure and with glaring weaknesses in the design. The Terran materials used in the frame hadn't liked the dirt on the Shriek homeworlds either. The initial concept had been just simple load carriers. It was only when the subsurface fighting had begun that Terran soldiers had started wearing them through combat. He'd only seen the second-generation Exos briefly, during the ending of days, when the last remnants held the moons. They were stripped down, thinner, followed the angles of the body more closely. Less raw strength, but quicker, faster, better movement tracking and durable as the creature who wore it. Shrike tech twisted to a Terran purpose. Bones. But still, just a machine constructed by a species barely out of their industrial revolution. When it was done, Jek stood with their red bloods mingling on his claws, and the familiar numbness came over him once more as the stimulants were filtered from his bloodstream. He looked to the sky, baring his throat in homage to the fallen. "It is a good day to die," he murmured. The Disretti, standing in a semicircle, looked on from a distance. John was also looking from the ship's hold, his jaw working, tensing the muscles in his cheeks. Kolorikta's baleful stare cowed him, but he steeled himself, throwing his arms wide. "The Terran is no longer threatened!" The underlying mockery was not lost on the Elder Shriek. His voice rumbled across the hangar. "He has called to others. So let them come." Jek turned away dismissively, stalking away into the waiting room, half hoping a Deseret would give him an excuse. His ears caught a ragged sound. The Terran was still living, slumped where he had fallen against some cargo sleds near the hangar doors. Like all of his kind, his body struggled on even when the result was inevitable. He dragged another breath of Atmo into his punctured chest cavity. His single heart tried to force an ever-dwindling blood supply through smashed limbs. Hydraulic fluid leaked from the leg of his exo to pool with his blood on the deck. A warrior deserved a quick death. Jack moved forward, limping a little on the crushed muscles and bruised bone of his leg. The pain was starting as the battle fury left him. He was about to enter the docking bay again when he halted. With an excruciating effort, the Terran rolled from his side and pushed himself up until he was half sitting against the cargo sled, the suit sensing his muscles' faint contractions and doing most of the work. With a low moan, he pulled his dipping head up, letting his helmet thud back against the sled. Through the shattered face mask, Jack could see his face, very white against the black of his armor. But whiter still were his teeth. His vision was already fading, the ringed eyes staring unseeing into the distance, perhaps already looking upon the faces of his fallen war brothers. But the mouth smiled, and even as he smiled, his hands lost their strength, and one of what he clutched in his lap spilled from between his fingers to roll across the deck. The Terran let out his last breath, spurting blood between his lips in a laugh. The Deseret huddled closer, puzzled, trying to see. What is that? Jack took a step forward, halfway into the hangar, leaning to look at the object rolling toward him. Someone was screaming. He heard 2 shots from a kinetic. Kulriktha's roar blasted through the hangar. Then someone howled closer. One of the Desreti. Grenade! The stunner was supposed to incapacitate a detainee for several minutes. Perhaps the contacts hadn't been flush against the Terran's skin. The bones whined as motors strained through their range of motion. The Terran already had one fist under him. The shoulder joint made a grinding, harsh noise as he strained to push himself up. With a groan, he collapsed, slowly, liking the air had turned to jelly. Mavic sprinted toward Bulver, pulling the groggy Atlian up and stooping to heave his brother over his shoulders. Bulver offered a weak protest. "Shut up," Mavic said bluntly, rummaging through several boxes of medical supplies. Kuvi sent a nervous glance toward the Terran. He was still struggling weakly, though his limbs flailed without coordination. He cast a look into the passageway, through the broken door. He started toward it, then shook his head. Both Terrans had come from that direction. He hurried toward his 2 crew, giving the groaning Terran a wide berth. "Boss?" Kuvi pointed with his chin toward the opposite doors. Mavic flexed his head spikes in acknowledgement, starting for the exit. He paused next to a Deseret's bed, then tapped a few times on a touchscreen. "Oops, painkillers are off." He leaned toward the injured Deseret, nodding toward the Terran who was trying once again to rise. "Maybe ask him for help." His head spikes flared once, then he marched away, easily handling his brother's weight. Kuvi followed him out of the room, then spun on his heel and sprinted back. His gaze swept the floor, searching. He found it in a corner under a column of medical supplies and drawers. The Terran pistol. He threw one look over his shoulder as he snatched up a dropped blade from the floor. The skeletal soldier had one knee under him, and Kuvi could hear the grating hum of his bones as one arm strained to lift his weight. The Terran's teeth were bared, clenched tight in pain, and there was blood staining the whiteness. The ringed eyes followed Kuvi out of the room. "I'm fine, idiot." Mavic promptly dumped the other Atlian to the floor. Bulver tried to rise, stumbled against the wall, muttering under his breath. They moved down the passage at a steady jog. Mavic turned to Kuvi, grabbing his arm and jabbing a syringe into it. Kuvi grunted in surprise. "Sorry, boss, I'll hold your hand next time." He turned to Bulver. "Your turn." Entry shots, or entries, were a concoction of antibiotics, vaccinations, and sugars. No matter where you go among the stars, the highest kill count always belongs to microscopic organisms. In the core, the problems of disease were easily solved by routinely administering entries to any creatures arriving on world. They were cheap, mass-produced, and effective. Creatures from outside the core, or those with more exotic immune systems, required more custom-tailored options, from specialized cocktails to full quarantine and deep cleansing. Although routine from an interplanetary travel standpoint, it was a subject no species took lightly. However, among the core worlds, Interplanetary travel had been occurring for long enough that there were no longer many strains of disease exclusive to one world, and immune systems had adapted accordingly. Kuvi and his crew had never intended to make the descent onto the world, so they'd only been given basic entries as they attempted to pass the checkpoint, despite making the jump from far outside the core. Kuvi thought he'd probably been taken to the medical bay in the first place for a more thorough workup. It was attentive thinking on Mavik's part to find a few of them. It would prevent infection from their myriad of cuts and scrapes, as well as give them a rush of energy from the sugars. He had also managed to find a patch of synthetic skin, pasting it over the gash in his forehead from where the door had hit him. "Where are we going?" Bulver was massaging a spot behind his shoulder as he ran, grimacing in pain. Kuvi turned down a branching pathway, noticing that Mavik had a stun gun slung over his shoulder. "Ship's on this level." The Shriek had taken the passage with the most direct route to the deck 4 hangar. The retreating Atlians had backed away down the opposite hall, most likely toward the closest security station. According to the maps posted at every intersection, Kuvi and his crew should be able to circle around to the docking bay, hopefully without seeing another creature. Kuvi didn't mention it, but he had a sinking suspicion that the Terran and the Shriek were heading toward his ship. If they were, there's no question who would arrive first, as he was taking a longer route, avoiding any place he suspected there might be guards or soldiers. Yet the hallways and passages were deserted. It was quiet except for their breathing and the echo of their footfalls on the deck. It was unnerving. Even in a station this small, they should have met at least one creature even this far from the publicly accessible areas. As they traveled, their pace slowed, eventually settling into something just faster than a walk, so they could strain their ears for sounds of any other activity. Mavik pulled the stun gun off his shoulder and carried it ready across his front, finger nervously tapping the trigger guard. As they ran, Mavik quickly explained how he and Bulver had come to be released from their cell. Bulver muttered darkly about the terrible security protocols, insisting they would have been out soon anyway. "Wing Commander!" Kuvi shot a glance behind him down the empty passage. "They changed the uniform. You got out before they switched." After the border skirmishes on Old 4-6, the Atlian military had undergone a minor restructuring. The two brothers' terms of service had extended past Kuvi's, leaving them dealing with the aftermath while Kuvi and Fen had started their new business together, before fate brought them together again. Speaking of his first mate, Fen would try to get to the ship, Kuvi was sure. Always rendezvous at the ship when a job went wrong. If the ship was inaccessible, they had meet-up points along the outer rim. Kuvi thought for a moment. He hoped Mavik or Bulver remembered the coordinates. A job had never gone quite this wrong before. The Terran weapon was heavy in his hand. The grip was uncomfortable, made for manipulators with a single opposable digit. It wasn't even lightweight alloy, looked more like worn carbon steel, though the grips down each side of the butt appeared to be some kind of wood. He flipped it over in his hands, trying to remember how kinetic weapons worked. He'd only seen a few in his lifetime on the outer rim. Hammer? That struck and ignited the chemical propellants. He gingerly pulled it back, but it didn't move, and he thought it looked already cocked. He turned it over again. There were emblems and script of some kind written along the barrel and side, though he couldn't make any sense of it. He went to turn it again, and his hand moved on the grip, showing something scratched into the metal just below the hammer. It was another stylized Terran skull, the lower jaw missing and 4 long teeth extending downward, like dripping paint. "Rack the slide," Bulver offered, looking on with interest. It took him a moment and Bulver's impatient gestures, but he gripped the top of the pistol and jerked it back, slightly surprised at the effort. Something shot out of the side of the weapon, and Kuvi started. His thumb slipped, pressing a button behind the trigger guard. A rectangular object dropped out of the butt. Kuvi gasped a few choice words, dancing to avoid the metal clattering on the deck. Bulver's spikes convulsed in laughter as he snatched the rectangle from the floor. He held up his other hand, pinching a shiny item between 2 fingers from where he had caught it out of the air. "This is what they fire." His head spikes were flexing in mirth. "Big bullets," he continued more thoughtfully. Using a thumb, he levered another bullet out of the rectangle, the magazine, like the power cell in an energy weapon. Mavik's spine snickered. He regained composure when Kuvi frowned at him. Bulver was swearing quietly again. 2, he muttered angrily. This kinetic has 2 rounds left. He snapped the bullets back into the magazine with rather more force than necessary, handing it back to his captain. Do they use those in combat? Mavic asked. You're not going to do anything with 2 shots. It's like a stun gun. He tapped a finger against the magazine of his rifle. Bulver just shook his head, glaring behind them for another check. Cuvey slammed the magazine into the pistol with the butt of his hand, pulling back the slide. The metallic noises sounded ugly. Massively impractical weapon. Heavy, dirty, extremely limited ammo, too many moving parts, and probably slow muzzle velocity. Cuvey hefted the cool metal in his hand. Stars, it felt like power, though. They were coming up on the docking bay now, having seen no creature save 2 staff in the distance who had ducked around a corner when Mavic had shown his stun gun. The station was still eerily quiet, though Cuvey swore he could hear the irregular vibrations of speech in the distance. Without consciously agreeing, they all slowed to a halt behind the last corner. Mavic and Bulver switched, Mavic taking point and Bulver scanning the rear. The Terran pistol was still cold and heavy in Cuvey's hands. He gripped it tighter, taking care to keep his digits far from the trigger. He forced out one breath, quickly through his teeth, then tapped Mavic on the shoulder. Just like basic, all that time ago. Crouching walk. Clearing the last hallway, ducking around the entrances where it branched off. The hissed ready and clear as they moved forward, slapping shoulders to signal the next movement. Cuvey could definitely hear voices now. The irregular vibrations still too faint to make out language and tone. Mavic had the stun gun pulled tight into his shoulder. He ducked around the entrance, spinning left. Cuvey entered just behind him, sweeping right, feeling Bulver's comforting mask covering his back. Clear! Clear, Cuvey murmured back. Rows of chairs and benches through the deserted room. Along one wall was a counter where customs officials would provide their services. In any other station, the docking bay and waiting room would be separated with antechambers and multiple layers of airlock. This station just had red and white caution paint keeping civvies back from the single set of blast doors. That had to be against some kind of regulation. Civvies were way too dumb not to have some law about that. Cuvey wondered where the vending machines were. There was usually cheap food. He gestured to Mavic, and the Atlian ducked behind a row of chairs, making his way toward the other side of the room. There was some kind of rhythmic chant, coming faintly through the triple-wide doors. Cuvey didn't recognize the tongue, though he wasn't sure the sounds were loud enough for him to anyway. Mavic was coming up on the other side of the door now. Cuvey and Bulver were approaching it at the same pace. His crew looked as tense as Cuvey felt. A roar echoed from inside the hangar. A deep, thundering vibration that smashed through his ear canals and thudded deep into his chest. Mavic dove against the wall, pressing his back into it. Cuvey and Bulver did the same. The pistol was very hard as he gripped it. He wondered if a kinetic could punch through Shrike scales. He then wondered if it would matter. 2 bullets would probably just make his own death more painful. The roar didn't come again. Just a steady, chaotic series of thudding and the faint sound of distant, heavy breathing. Cuvey had been in enough barroom brawls and back alley scuffles to recognize a fight. Mavic pushed with his legs, sliding his shoulder up the wall until he could see out of the synthoglass windows into the hangar. Cuvey peeked around the doors at the same time. The docking bay opened in front of them, almost twice as long as it was wide. Along the right wall were the enormous outside doors. 3 landing strips were outlined in white. 2 were empty, but the closest one was occupied by an Astral-class freighter. The brief flash of joy was instantly stifled by the sight of a cluster of Desreti around one of the landing struts. There was another group in a semicircle on the other side of the bay. Past them, he could see the hulking head and shoulders of a Shriek, circling slowly, with flashes of near-instantaneous movement. He could barely see the smaller creature through the crowded observers. Perhaps a Desret had made a wrong move and the monstrous creature was toying with him. There was a growl of pain, and the Shriek stumbled backwards, limping on one leg. The Desreti still around the ship craned their necks with renewed interest. Cuvey counted. 10? They could take 10. The Desreti didn't seem to have any ranged weapons. An unearthly howl echoed through the hangar. The Shrike wrenched upward with both arms, the muscles in his chest and shoulders bulging under the matte gray of his scales. Cuvey's head spikes flexed. It was a Terran, The second one from the medical bay, he was sure. The Shrike had him by the alloy rod along one arm and a fold of the material between two armor plates on his side. The beast lifted him until their faces were level, growling through his fangs into the blank face mask of the small creature. The Terran struggled. Even from here, Kuvi could hear the high-pitched whine of the motors powering his bones, straining against the Shriek's massive strength. The Shriek let out a hoarse grunt as the Terran freed his side and sliced one of the blades along his bicep, the flashing metal edge skating across the scales with a harsh noise. He swung the smaller creature by his arm into a cargo sled, lifting the dazed Terran once again into the air. There was an instant of silence while the Shriek bared his fangs. Then the claws shicked out and the monster punched into the Terran's side, driving the sharp points through the body armor. The Terran spasmed, arching his back and throwing his arms out as the points jutted out of his chest. The Desreti watching cheered or moaned, and Kuvi saw currency and trinkets change hands. But the Shriek wasn't done. While the Terran was still arching in agony, the claws of the hand around the limb of his bones extended to pierce through his upper arm and glance off his armored torso. This was it. Everyone was distracted. Kuvi tapped the wall to get his crew's attention, gesturing toward the ship. Mavic frantically shook his head. Kuvi flared his spikes in anger. This was the chance. Why didn't he go? They had ranged weapons. He held up the pistol, urgently signaling to move. Mavic shook his head again, mouthing for Kuvi to stay. The Shriek dropped his opponent, the body falling limply against the cargo sled. He spread his arms wide, shouting in his guttural language across the bay toward them. Kuvi experienced a moment of abject terror before another voice answered, quieter but still rough. The other Shriek. He realized that Mavic had the angle to see where Kuvi couldn't, into his ship's open cargo bay. The other Shriek must be there. He thanked whoever was listening that his crew had a good sense of self-preservation over following orders. Another sullen sentence came from the Shrike across the bay, and he turned to stalk away. Mavic was jerking his head. Kuvi followed the gesture with his eyes. There was an Atlian female crouched behind a skid loader. Her shoulders shook with a silent whimper, and her hands pressed into her mouth below her wide eyes. The customs official from the inspection. Kuvi tapped the barrel of the Terran pistol against the deck quietly, then a bit louder. She started hard, head spinning to locate the source of the noise. Her eyes locked on Kuvi. He frantically waved her over. She took a step back, turning to cast a terrified gaze toward his ship. Kuvi hissed in frustration, gesturing harder. She threw one last horrified look at the other end of the bay, toward the blooded claws of the Shrike who had turned to again face the hangar. He was glaring at where the dead Terran had fallen. The female Atlian hesitated once more, then sprinted toward Kuvi. The few Desreti grouped around the ship swung around, hearing her run, pulling blades. Mavic rose, dropping the leading Desret with a dart. He pumped the mechanism, tucking the weapon harder into his shoulder, sending another furred creature to the floor, muscles jittering from the electrical charge. "Come on!" Kuvi screamed, trying to pull her in with sheer willpower. She could make it if she didn't hesitate. The elder Shriek ignored the ramp, dropping from the hold to shake the deck as he landed, powering into a full sprint almost the instant his feet touched down. She could still make it. Mavic switched targets, sending the next dart toward the Shriek. It glanced off the scales of his temple, spinning away, aiming for the eyes. She saw the dart flash past her and took 2 steps sideways. Kuvi groaned internally, but she could still make it. He yelled again, urging her toward him. Mavic sent another dart toward the Shriek, forcing him to slow and shield his face. He turned a few degrees, aiming toward a Desret. He pulled the trigger and heard the empty sound of escaping gas, out of darts. Kuvi clutched the pistol tightly, the metal cutting into his palm. She could still make it, she was so close. He reached out a hand, carefully aiming the pistol with his other. Wait, now! He pulled the trigger just as her fingers met his. The recoil forced his arm back. The sound left his ears ringing and useless. He gritted his teeth and ignored his jarred arm, pulling the trigger again. No! He could barely hear himself screaming. She had jerked away as the pistol fired, clutching her ears, eyes wider than he thought possible. Kuvi snatched at the air where her hand had been an instant before. A klaxon blared, sounding very distant in his damaged eardrums. The kinetics had impacted the hangar ceiling, blowing holes through a panel and shorting out an electrical bank in a shower of sparks. The triple-wide doors shot closed on their rails, spinning Kuvi around when they smashed into his reaching arm. Emergency lockdown. Mavic screamed a curse, punching the heavy durasteel. Kuvi stared through the thick panel of mesh-reinforced synthoglass. The Shrike was already turning away, fangs bared as he bellowed something through the hangar, bathed in the red emergency lighting. The female was being dragged away by the Desret leader, the merc's teeth showing next to the military stripes scarred into the fur of his cheek. And behind them, next to Kuvi's ship, stood the Terran, the one from the beginning, Kuvi's blade at his side, looking toward the door with narrowed eyes. Then the hydraulics sealed the locks, half an instant before the muffled crump of an explosion came through the door. Kuvi had time to see the shockwaves slam into the creatures inside before the autonomous systems slid more reinforcement panels across the synthoglass, leaving him staring at the cold durasteel. "What was that?" Warning sirens blared throughout the station. Every fifth lighting panel had blinked into a deep red, staining the surfaces with color. Explosion in Docking Bay 4. The sirens continued their steady shrieking. Pressure loss? Negative. Appears to be internal damage only. Deck let out a lungful of atmo he hadn't realized he'd been holding. They'd know for sure soon enough, if the continuous whine of hull breach rose above even the wailing sirens. "Get a team up there immediately." "Can't, sir. Almost the entirety of Deck 4 is locked down." "Override it!" "I'm trying, sir." Deck ground his teeth. Manual overrides were down. Comms were down. Elevators were down. They were reduced to using emergency hatches and service ladders to move between decks, communicating on the personal radios of the station staff. Even the manual remote lockdowns were inoperable, else he would have sealed the entire station and waited for backup. It had taken an explosion to trigger the emergency measures. Unfortunately, they were now blocked off from any sort of damage control. He dragged a hand over his face. This whole situation. Nightmare. Weird thing was, the artificial gravity was intact. Wait, the weird thing was this tiny out-of-date station having artigrav instead of relying on centrifugal force. Probably intended to be upgraded, then forgotten about. This station wasn't under attack. They controlled every FTL lane in this void space. It was that twice-cursed Terran, or Kuvi, or the Shrike, or the Desreti. But he couldn't stop Doe's voice from whispering inside his skull. You see, Terrans don't need FTL lanes to make a jump. They'd managed to evacuate roughly half the civvies before the launch computers had stopped responding. The rest of them were being sheltered in a hangar bay on Deck 2, probably collectively dumping waste into their trousers with the warning sirens going off. It might seem counterintuitive, but a hangar is probably one of the safest places in the void. The risk of docking procedures gone wrong ensures multiple levels of redundant security features. The civvies were basically in an armored box that would self-seal at any detected damage. The only place safer, perhaps, was the central control room, where he was trying to get a handle on this mayhem. The evacuated civvies, combined with the station's lack of communication, guaranteed someone, somewhere, must take notice. He just had to figure out how to contain this situation until they arrived. Had the others of his kind hunted Doe through the FTL lanes? His train of thought was interrupted by the sirens timing out and abruptly limping to a halt with a weak croak. They'd still be screaming around the sealed portions of Deck 4. Half the red lighting panels switched back to their natural color. Now only 1 in 10 were the ominous red. Dick glanced across the room. The crew of that Astral-class freighter were being questioned, although they hadn't been able to provide anything useful. He needed their captain. A soldier slid a box onto the desk in front of him. Deck returned the salute absently, opening the lid. This is what Doe had been trying to find when he'd forced Dak into the security lockup. This had been piled in some corner office with the belongings of the injured Desreti, those presumed innocent of any wrongdoing, but who had still been taken off the freighter for medical attention. Only the crew of the freighter had had their belongings stored in the security station. The lid hit the table next to the box. It was empty almost. He pulled out the first item. A small rectangle that fit in his palm. There was a hole through one end, and a length of cord had been passed through it, probably to wear around the neck. He turned it over, noticing a hairline crack toward one end. He worked his finger into it, pulling off a small cap. It was some sort of data storage. He had revealed the conductive end. He inspected the bare metal, looking at the hollow middle where he could see the contacts. It looked the same on both sides, and he wondered if it was often plugged in upside down. The frenzied activity around him was lost to his senses as he drew out the next item. It was a small, flat piece of metal, curving down to a shallow point. Opposite the point was a short piece of cloth. Etched onto the surface of the metal was the profile of a Terran. Not dough, he was certain. He fumbled for the comm in his pocket, not taking his eyes off the strange object. One pass with his electronic device told him the item was a dark purple, except for a border around the metal part and the silhouette of the Terran that was a shiny yellow, some color called gold. Heirloom, maybe. The next was a square of paper, approximately the size of his palm. It was a blank white on one side, the other held the likeness of 3 creatures. One was Doe, there was no question. He had one arm over the shoulders of another Terran, but this one was shorter, thinner, more delicate. Perhaps a female of the species. The fur on her head was much longer and arranged over one shoulder. Another Terran, a youngling, sat on Doe's backwards knee. She, he assumed, also had the fur on her head much longer than Doe's. All 3 were staring out of the paper at him, showing their teeth. Dec realized with a jolt that this wasn't a threat. This was an expression of happiness. He found himself staring at the faded paper for longer than he'd intended. He flexed his spines a little, throwing the paper back into the box and reaching for the lid. He was about to seal it again when he halted. In the corner, something had caught the light and glinted up at him. It was a simple, unadorned band of metal, shiny from long wear. He almost unconsciously went to try its fit on one of his fingers, but halted at the last second. He wrestled with something in his mind, he wasn't sure what. Then he gently placed the ring on the center of the picture. "Sir?" He slammed the lid down, turning from the box. The medical tech shifted nervously. "Sir, we're dealing with a combat species." "What?" Dec said the word flatly. The tech shifted again, the spikes along his spine flaring uncomfortably. "I didn't have the time or resources to get anything close to a full—" "Tell me what you know. Now." The Atlian tried to calm his spines, clearing his throat. He started to speak, then looked down at a data pad, obviously reading something previously prepared. The Terran maintains a hypermetabolism, making use of highly efficient energy storage and an extreme appetite. His digestive system is— He looked up at the wing commander. "Good. Very good. Look." Dec examined the data pad. It had rotating 3-dimensional model of the Terran, marked with glowing lines, specks, and patches all over. "That's all scar tissue." "Torture?" "I don't think so. It's all occurred at different times during this creature's life cycle. The arrangement of collagen fibers leads me to believe this creature has self-healed." "How would they close wounds like that?" Dec pointed to a long one down the model's back. "Artificial skin?" "I don't see any evidence of—" "This species must have excellent medical tech." "I think stitches." Dec scowled at the tech. "Or staples." Dec blinked once. "This creature will form scar tissue in response to almost any injury. Ugly, but effective." The tech's spines were flaring again. "We administered standard entries and were working on a full medical profile. But his immune system was already beginning to adapt. He had a strong reaction of, antibodies were incredibly—" "Sum it up." He could tell the tech was somewhat hurt and flustered by the interruption. "Sir, this species heals like a shrike." "Maybe better." Dec was about to inquire further when one of his soldiers breathlessly interrupted. He followed to a bank of monitors. "This is the makeshift medical station we set up in emergency response. Now look, here are the injured Desretti, the guards, and a few of your soldiers." The Atlian sped up the recording for a moment, then returned it to normal speed. "Now here we have, Kuvi being escorted in. Now they all jump up and look over. There's a door there we can't see." Dec watched the creatures backing away, obviously wary of something just out of the camera's vision. You can't really hear, but it sounds like someone says "found you" through a translator. Then the shrieks start roaring, and our men back away a little bit. This next bit is easy to make out. This sergeant here, he tapped the screen, tells everyone to stand down. Someone answers, can't tell what, and then that shrike says something, but I can't pick it up. I think the voice register's too low. Dec watched the sergeant moving in a half-crouch with the blade ready in his hand, the other extended outward. He paused for a moment, half out of the frame, then was hurled backwards by an enormous force. Deck couldn't hold back an oath as the soldier smashed back into a Deseret's bed. "Now, here's the interesting bit," the tech said impassively. "The Terran, Doe, comes running through the doors, followed by those two aliens. He stops and dives away, and then we lose audio." "Why do you lose—" The tech zoomed in on the wall behind Doe, tapping back and forth between two grainy frames. "A hole appears in this wall at the same instant we lose it. Also, with the way Doe is diving away and scrambles out of the room, as well as the reactions from the Atlians and Desreti, I think someone fired an energy weapon. 4 or 5 shots. Deck wondered if he'd be immune to surprise at the end of this day's turn. Energy weapons. Sure, why not? The tech was still speaking. Hit some wiring and you would have messed up a mic pretty badly. Still, the holes don't show signs of thermal damage, and it's unlikely to knock out just audio. I can't tell though, this video isn't exactly quality. Nothing in this station was. Something knocks out a lighting panel, then we lose video. It's possible a shot fired into the ceiling, but we've been almost systematically losing audio and video on decks 5 and 6, so I'm not sure this isn't deliberate. The tech turned from his monitor. "Sir, I think we're under attack." The soldier he had followed over stepped forward. "Sir, we sent a team up. We've got several in critical and almost a dozen significantly injured. All wounds inflicted with blunt force trauma. Unfortunately, they're trapped behind the emergency seals, although they seem to be fine as long as we get some real medical help to them as soon as possible. They report they were attacked by 2 Terrans in some kind of exosuits before they chased after the Shriek." Deck's insides were going cold. It was happening just as Doe had said it would. And now he couldn't even exchange Doe as payment for the station's safety. He nodded numbly to the next person in line. The aide handed him a datapad. "These are the profiles of the crew of the Astral. Classic lowlifes. Nothing major, just petty crimes. Except for the 3 Atlians. Trig Kuvi, 7 Mavic, and Gul Bulver. We received standard profiles, but just before the data transmissions cut out, secondary profiles came in, returned with your authorization code. 3/4 of these reports are redacted. The first set mentioned military service during the border skirmishes on Old 4-6, but, sir, they were into something serious." Deck remembered screaming at the 2 big Atlians to chase the Terran. Remembered the military salute the one had performed. A spate of intense swearing fouled the air. "Sir! Wing Commander, over here now!" Deck hurried to the group of Atlians huddled over another monitor. This just happened. Deck 5. Deck leaned toward the screen. The monitor showed a camera's view, looking down a semi-dark hallway for 4 or 5 meters before it turned. He watched the static image for several moments, until something stepped around the corner. It was bipedal with 2 upper limbs and a single head. The proportions matched, it was a Terran. But this one was not defenseless like Doe had been. Combat-worn ballistic armor covered its frame, the plasma burns standing out against the matte of the paint. Faded red stamped his chest with the broken horns of a Shrike warrior, below a knife almost as long as his forearm strapped hilt down across his torso. Belt-like links of metal cylinders occupied the opposite diagonal across his chest. There was some kind of heavy weapon resting across one shoulder, bulkier than a rifle, balanced with one hand. Bones outlined his form with a metal skeleton, seamlessly mirroring the Terran's movements. Powered exoskeletons were common, but these were somehow different. These were brutal, bare machine without polymer guards to smooth the jagged edges or plastic pieces to streamline the rugged form. These didn't pretend to have been built for anything but combat, stripped down to cold alloy. The helmet was dark as the armor, save for a score gouged down one hollow cheek, flashing bright without the black paint. On either side of the blank face mask, curving down the jawline to jut beyond the chin, were the secondary horns of a Shriek warrior. Deck's insides twisted. What kind of predator wore Shrike horns as a trophy? Something came after the Terran, a beast on 4 limbs covered in short, coarse fur. Heavy muscle rippled with every step. It was almost as tall as the Terran and nearly twice as long, with a tail that it kept low. It was lightly armored along its spine and shoulders, and it opened its mouth as it slunk along the hallway, showing a row of jagged fangs with long eye teeth. The Terran didn't break his stalking walk as he raised his free arm. His extended fingers curled over smallest digit first in a kind of wave. Then the arm dropped once more, and the next stride took him out of the field of view, followed by the other padding creature. The tech tapped back a few frames, freezing the image. The beast crouched behind, the light glittering on its bared fangs. The Terran's blank face mask stared impassively at the camera, and the camera stared impassively back at the waving soldier.